History Secrets.
The history of ancient civilizations raises a central question about how human societies function. How do you control large populations? When small communities transform into complex societies, a fundamental problem emerges. Social coordination, political order, collective stability. The first great civilizations of the world faced exactly this challenge, and each of them developed different solutions to organize millions of people under a single system. Among the earliest complex societies in history are four fundamental civilizations: ancient China, the Indus Valley Civilization, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. Each of them found a distinct path to solve the problem of social control. In China, for example, the solution was bureaucracy, a highly structured administrative system based on exams and meritocratic selection. For centuries, Chinese families dedicated enormous effort to prepare their children for imperial exams. Passing these exams meant entering the civil service and becoming part of the state's administrative machine. This system created social stability because it channeled the ambition of families toward an institutionalized objective: serving the state. In the Indus Valley Civilization, the solution appears to have been different. There, social organization was deeply linked to religion, a religion that, according to some interpretations, emphasized values of harmony, peace, and equality. This spiritual tradition eventually influenced later religious currents in South Asia, including elements that would later appear in Buddhism. In Mesopotamia, however, the geographic context created a very different reality. Unlike China, the region had few natural barriers, no major mountains or oceans to guarantee protection. This made the region extremely vulnerable to invasions, and, as a result, constant wars became a central part of political organization. Frequent conflicts helped keep society mobilized, creating an environment where war functioned as a mechanism of social cohesion. But perhaps the most unique model emerged in ancient Egypt. There, political stability was built around a central figure: the pharaoh. In Egyptian religious belief, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He was considered a divine manifestation, a living embodiment of sacred forces that maintained the order of the world. This belief had profound consequences, because the authority of the pharaoh did not depend solely on military force. It was tied to the very spiritual structure of society. But this also created a problem. If the pharaoh was human, his life was constantly at risk. Conspiracies, palace intrigues, succession disputes. Ruling an empire required more than religious legitimacy. It required specific psychological skills. This raises an intriguing question. What truly defines a great leader in history? We are often taught that leadership requires classical virtues: wisdom, empathy, responsibility, the ability to inspire trust. These qualities are certainly important in many areas of life, but some historical analyses suggest that leaders operating in highly competitive environments develop another set of characteristics. Among them, three abilities frequently appear in analyses of political behavior. The first is unpredictability. When a leader is difficult to predict, opponents find it harder to anticipate their decisions. The second is a high tolerance for stress. Leaders often face enormous pressure, crises, conflicts, constant political attacks. Maintaining emotional stability in this environment can be a decisive factor for political survival. The third characteristic mentioned by some analysts is emotional detachment. the ability to make hard decisions without being paralyzed by immediate feelings. These three characteristics can be summarized in a specific psychological concept: dissociation. In psychology, dissociation refers to a mental state in which a person partially distances themselves from their own emotions or experiences, as if observing the situation from the outside. In environments of extreme pressure, this ability can allow a leader to continue making rational decisions, even under highly stressful circumstances. Some historical interpretations suggest that certain systems of power may have attempted to develop or stimulate this type of mental state in their rulers, especially in contexts where political power was surrounded by intrigue and constant threats. In ancient Egypt, for example, complex mythologies played a central role in the symbolic formation of royal authority. Stories involving gods such as Ra, Osiris, and Horus structured the Egyptian view of power and cosmic order. These myths were not merely stories. They formed the basis of rituals, symbols, and narratives that legitimized the power of the pharaoh. In many ancient cultures, rituals and mythologies functioned as instruments of psychological formation, creating identities, establishing social roles, and reinforcing political authority. Regardless of how exactly these processes functioned, one thing seems clear: great systems of power have always sought to shape the behavior and mindset of their leaders. Because governing complex societies requires much more than formal authority. It requires emotional control, strategic capacity, and, often, immense psychological resilience. That may be why history is filled with leaders whose personalities seem difficult to understand. Figures capable of alternating between contradictory behaviors, extreme calm in moments of crisis, or unexpected decisions that surprise allies and adversaries. These characteristics raise an interesting reflection. To what extent does individual psychology influence the fate of societies? And to what extent do political systems shape the people who reach power? This question remains open, but history suggests that understanding the behavior of leaders can be just as important as understanding the events that shape the world. When we analyze more deeply the power structures of ancient civilizations, something curious becomes clear. Power rarely depends only on military strength or economic wealth. It also depends on psychological control, control of beliefs, control of perceptions, control of identity. In ancient Egypt, for example, mythology played a much deeper role than simply explaining the world. It functioned as a symbolic system of power. Among the main Egyptian gods were three central figures: Ra, Osiris, and Horus. Ra was the sun god, the force that brought life to the universe. Every night, according to the myth, he descended into the underworld to face a colossal serpent that tried to devour the sun. And every night he had to defeat this enemy to ensure the birth of a new day. Osiris, in turn, represented civilization, the just pharaoh, the ruler who established order and prosperity. But his story was marked by tragedy. His own brother, Set, conspired against him, deceived him, and destroyed him. According to the myth, Osiris was killed, and his body was torn apart, scattered across the world. But his wife, Isis, gathered each fragment, reconstructing her husband's body. From this process, Horus was born, the son who would inherit the mission of restoring the throne and confront Set to reclaim rightful power. At first glance, this story may seem like just a mythological narrative, a set of religious legends, but some interpretations suggest that these myths had a much deeper function. They could function as symbolic models of identity, archetypes that shaped the worldview of ruling elites. Each figure represented a specific type of psychological role. Ra represented the divine hero, the force that fights against chaos. Osiris represented the unjustly victimized figure, the ruler who suffers betrayal and destruction. And Horus represented the avenger, the heir who restores order. Some analyses suggest that these figures could function as symbolic identities that shaped the behavior of the pharaoh, mental roles that the ruler needed to embody in different moments. In certain situations, the pharaoh needed to act as Aratir, the defender of order against chaos. In other circumstances, he could assume the role of Osiris, the figure who suffers, who endures, who symbolizes sacrifice. And in moments of political or military conflict, the identity of Horus could emerge, the ruler who reclaims power and defeats his enemies. This symbolic multiplicity may have helped shape the mindset of rulers, allowing them to operate across different psychological roles. When we observe leaders throughout history, something similar seems to occur. Many of them display highly complex personalities, capable of rapidly shifting between different behavioral styles. In moments of crisis, they may act with calculated coldness. In other moments, they may mobilize heroic or symbolic narratives to inspire followers. This ability to shift between identities may be related to the psychological phenomenon known as dissociation. In modern psychology, dissociation does not necessarily mean disorder. It can occur in a mild and everyday way. All of us play different roles depending on the context. At home, we are one person. At work, another. Among friends, yet another. These roles are not necessarily false. They are part of social adaptation. But in environments of extreme power, this psychological flexibility can become much more intense, because leaders face pressures that most people will never experience. Decisions that affect millions, military conflicts, economic crises, constant threats. To survive in this environment, some leaders may develop a kind of emotional detachment, an ability to observe the situation as if they were outside of it. This detachment can allow for rapid decision-making, but it can also generate behaviors that seem incomprehensible to external observers. Throughout history, many rulers have been described as unpredictable, charismatic at certain moments, extremely cold in others. This duality raises a fascinating question. Does power transform the psychology of individuals? Or are certain psychological profiles more likely to reach positions of power? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between these two possibilities. Because complex systems of power do not only select certain types of individuals, they also shape those who reach the top. Over time, leaders learn to navigate environments of intense competition and develop mental strategies to deal with constant risk. This helps explain why history often presents leaders whose personalities seem contradictory, human, but at the same time, distant. Perhaps, ultimately, understanding power requires understanding something even deeper, the very nature of the human mind. When we begin to observe these psychological structures more closely, an even deeper question emerges. If leaders can be shaped by symbolic systems, rituals, and narratives, to what extent can the human mind be influenced? This question appears repeatedly throughout history. Religions, initiation rituals, military training, ideological programs. All of these systems seek to shape human behavior. In the case of ancient civilizations, many of these processes were linked to intense rituals, symbolic experiences, situations that provoked strong emotional impact. In many ancient cultures, initiation rituals involved moments of fear, isolation, or physical trials. These experiences created extremely powerful memories, and often deeply altered the individual's sense of identity. Some anthropologists describe this process as a form of symbolic reconstruction of personality. The individual undergoes a threshold experience and emerges from it with a new social identity. In ancient Egypt, certain rituals connected to mythology and royal authority may have played this type of symbolic role, especially within political and religious elites. These rituals reinforced the idea that the pharaoh was not just an ordinary ruler. He represented divine forces, cosmic roles, identities associated with the gods of Egyptian tradition. This perspective strengthened his authority in the eyes of the population, but it also helped shape his own perception of identity. When a person spends years being treated as a divine figure, their own mind may begin to internalize that role, and this can profoundly alter the way they think and act. At the same time, systems of power often use symbols and narratives to reinforce the loyalty of elites, oaths, secrets, restricted societies. These mechanisms create networks of trust and dependence, fundamental elements for maintaining the stability of complex political regimes. In many periods of history, political alliances functioned almost like discrete societies, where information, trust, and strategy were shared only among selected members. This dynamic aligns with concepts studied in game theory, a field that analyzes how individuals make strategic decisions in competitive environments. In systems where many actors compete for power simultaneously, alliances become essential. But these alliances can also be fragile. They change quickly. They are formed and dissolved as interests evolve. In this kind of environment, unpredictability can become a strategic advantage. If opponents cannot anticipate your decisions, it becomes much harder to build strategies against you. This logic appears repeatedly in international politics. Some leaders deliberately cultivate an image of unpredictability, creating uncertainty among both allies and adversaries. At the same time, high-level politics demands enormous psychological resilience. Constant criticism, political attacks, public pressure, unexpected crises. The ability to remain functional under this level of pressure is a common trait among leaders who stay in power for long periods. But there is also a darker side to this dynamic, when leaders become excessively detached from the human consequences of their decisions. Wars, sanctions, economic policies, all of these decisions can affect millions of people, and making them often requires a significant degree of emotional detachment. This reality raises an uncomfortable reflection. Does the global political system favor colder, more calculating personalities? Or does the structure of power itself transform those who reach the top? History does not offer a simple answer, but it shows that highly competitive environments tend to select individuals capable of handling extreme pressure. And often, this means developing a different relationship with emotions such as fear, guilt, or compassion. Still, understanding these dynamics does not mean accepting them as inevitable. On the contrary, it means recognizing how systems of power function. because only by understanding these structures is it possible to reflect on ways to build more balanced political systems. Systems where leadership is not defined only by strategic survival, but also by collective responsibility. This reflection remains open, just as the broader question of power remains open. Who truly controls the destiny of societies? Extraordinary individuals, or the invisible structures that shape their decisions? Perhaps the answer lies in the interaction between both, between the human mind and the systems of power it creates. If we look at this entire discussion from a historical perspective, an interesting conclusion begins to emerge. Power has never been just a matter of force. It has always been connected to the human mind, to how we perceive the world, to how we interpret reality. Ancient civilizations understood this very early on. They realized that controlling an empire did not mean only controlling territories. It meant controlling narratives, symbols, collective experiences. In ancient Egypt, for example, rituals and mythologies were not merely religious traditions. They helped structure the entire social order, reinforcing the authority of the pharaoh and consolidating the stability of the political system. By participating in these rituals, individuals were not just observing sacred stories. They were experiencing them, and this created a deep emotional connection with the structure of power. This type of mechanism appears in many societies: political ceremonies, national symbols, shared historical narratives. All of these elements help build collective identities, and collective identities are fundamental for maintaining social cohesion. But when we turn our attention to the leaders themselves, we notice something even more intriguing. Leadership often requires an unusual psychological capacity. Dealing with decisions that affect millions of people, enduring constant pressure, operating in environments where alliances shift rapidly. In such contexts, the human mind needs to develop mechanisms of adaptation, psychological strategies that allow individuals to face extreme situations. Among these mechanisms, emotional detachment frequently appears, an ability to observe events without being completely consumed by them. This ability can be useful to maintain clarity in moments of crisis, but it can also create a paradox. Because leaders who become too detached from the human consequences of their decisions may lose touch with the everyday reality of the population. This tension has accompanied politics for thousands of years, between strategic rationality and moral responsibility. Throughout history, some leaders have managed to balance these two dimensions. Others have been consumed by power itself. And perhaps this is one of the greatest lessons that history offers us. Power is not only an external force, it is also a psychological force. It transforms institutions, transforms societies, and often deeply transforms those who exercise it. That is why understanding power requires looking beyond political or military decisions. It requires observing the invisible structures that shape human behavior. Narratives, beliefs, rituals, experiences that form identities. These elements influence both rulers and the ruled, and help explain why certain power structures endure for centuries, while others collapse rapidly. Perhaps the real question is not only who governs, but how societies construct the systems that define who governs. Because in the end, leaders emerge within specific social structures, and those structures profoundly shape their choices. Thus, understanding power also means understanding the stories we tell about it, the narratives that legitimize authority, the symbols that sustain social order. And perhaps it is precisely at this intersection between mind, culture, and power that one of the greatest mysteries of human history lies. How entire societies manage to organize millions of people, following symbols, ideas, and leaders who represent those ideas. Fully answering this question may be impossible, but exploring it helps us better understand the world we live in, and the systems of power that continue to shape our future. Because, in the end, the history of power is also the history of the human mind. The past does not disappear. It remains recorded in ancient monuments, in forgotten texts, and in stories that have crossed centuries. Each discovery reveals a new enigma, and each enigma brings us closer to the truth. You are watching History Secrets. Subscribe and continue investigating the hidden secrets of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History Secrets.
In recent years, geopolitical videos and analyses have begun to circulate widely across the internet. Some of them make bold predictions about the future of the world order. Among these predictions, one in particular has drawn attention: the idea that a potential conflict between the United States and Iran could profoundly reshape the global balance. According to this interpretation, such a conflict would not be just a regional war. It would be a dispute with much broader impacts. A war of attrition, an economic war, a strategic war. Some analysts argue that Iran has prepared for decades to face external pressure, developing regional networks of allies, militias, armed groups, indirect combat strategies. Within this logic, instead of directly confronting a superior military power, the strategy would be to slowly weaken the opponent's economic and political infrastructure. Indirect attacks, pressure on energy routes, regional instability. One of the central areas of this dispute would be the Persian Gulf, a region through which a significant portion of global oil passes, and where several critical energy infrastructures are located. In this scenario, any disruption in energy routes could trigger chain reactions, increase in oil prices, pressure on financial markets, impacts on the global economy. But experts also highlight an important point. Determining who wins or loses a modern war can be extremely complex, especially when there is no direct territorial invasion. In traditional conflicts, defeat is usually defined by clear objectives: territorial conquest, fall of governments, formal surrender. But in contemporary conflicts, objectives can be much more fluid: destroy military capabilities, weaken opponents, reduce regional influence. In this context, success or failure depends on what goals were actually established, and whether those goals were achieved. For example, some modern military operations focus on limited objectives: neutralizing certain infrastructures, destroying specific arsenals, reducing the adversary's military capacity. When these objectives are achieved, the operation may be considered successful, even without deep political changes. But if more ambitious goals are set, such as regime change, the conflict can become much longer and more unpredictable. Another important factor is the technological evolution of conflicts: underground arsenals, tunnel networks, bases hidden in mountainous regions, These structures can make the complete neutralization of military systems more difficult. In addition, drones and medium-range missiles have become increasingly relevant in contemporary conflicts. These technologies allow relatively low-cost attacks against strategic targets. On the other hand, traditional military powers still possess significant advantages: air superiority, surveillance satellites, advanced intelligence systems. This combination creates a type of conflict that many analysts describe as atechnological attrition warfare, a confrontation in which each side tries to gradually destroy the operational capacity of the other. Within this logic, time becomes a crucial factor. Who can sustain operations longer? Who can maintain resources? Who can preserve alliances? Another important element in this type of war is the internal political dimension. Prolonged conflicts can generate internal pressure within the countries involved. Economic costs, social impacts, political debates. For this reason, many contemporary conflicts end not only through clear military victories, but through political decisions, changes in strategy, redefinition of objectives. Ultimately, modern wars rarely produce simple conclusions. They produce temporary balances, unstable agreements, new strategic disputes. Perhaps this is why absolute predictions about conflict outcomes tend to be so difficult. Geopolitics rarely follows predictable scripts. What seems inevitable at one moment can quickly change when new variables come into play. Technology, alliances, internal changes. And at the center of all these dynamics remains a constant reality of history. The global balance of power is always in transformation. When observing a modern conflict closely, a fundamental question emerges. What does it really mean to win a war? For much of history, the answer seemed relatively simple. An army invades a territory, defeats the opponent, captures cities, and imposes a new government. But many contemporary conflicts no longer follow this model. Instead of direct invasions, we see limited operations, strategic bombings, attacks on military infrastructure, economic pressure. Under these circumstances, the outcome of war depends much more on the objectives established. If a country defines its goal as destroying certain military capabilities of the opponent, then the success of the operation will be measured by that criterion. For example, neutralizing missile systems, reducing military infrastructure, destroying strategic installations. These can be specific operational objectives. More ambitious goals, such as overthrowing a government or completely transforming a political system, are usually much more difficult to achieve and often require prolonged military occupation. For this reason, many countries today avoid sending large contingents of ground troops into prolonged conflicts. This type of operation can generate high human and political costs. Instead, some modern strategies prioritize air superiority, control of airspace, constant monitoring of enemy territory. When a country manages to control another's airspace, it gains a significant advantage. It can monitor military movements, detect missile launchers, identify logistical activities. This creates a type of conflict based on gradual attrition. Each side tries to reduce the other's military capacity over time. In the case of Iran, for example, part of its military infrastructure was built in underground facilities, bunkers, tunnels, complexes hidden in mountainous regions. These structures make direct attacks more difficult, but they can also present logistical limitations. Equipment must eventually leave these facilities to be used, and at that moment, they may become vulnerable. This type of dynamic turns the conflict into a race against time. Each side tries to destroy the opponent's stock of military resources before its own arsenal is depleted. Another important factor is the complexity of the Iranian nuclear program. Unlike some concentrated military installations, this program is spread across different locations, some of them deeply buried or protected. This makes military operations more difficult. It requires constant surveillance, detailed intelligence, and repeated operations over time. In addition, contemporary conflicts often include indirect strategies, internal political pressure, support for regional groups, attempts to weaken adversarial governments through unconventional means. These strategies may include support for internal political groups, encouragement of regional movements, or attempts to generate instability within the opposing country. This type of approach shows how modern wars have become more complex. They involve military, political, economic, and social dimensions at the same time. For this reason, the final outcome of a conflict rarely depends only on direct military victories. It also depends on each country's ability to sustain pressure over time. Economic capacity, internal political stability, international support. All these factors influence the outcome. That is why many conflicts end not with absolute victories, but with new temporary balances, agreements, ceasefires, strategic shifts. In the end, modern wars often redefine the balance of power, without necessarily producing clear winners. And perhaps this is one of the most striking characteristics of the contemporary international system. Conflicts that rarely end definitively, but that continue to slowly shape the global order. Throughout history, civilizations have risen, disappeared, and left clues scattered through time. Some of these clues have been discovered, others are still waiting to be revealed. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these mysteries. This is Histoire Secrets. Subscribe and continue exploring history with us. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History Secrets.
Throughout modern history, different empires have dominated the global stage. Some conquered territories through military force. Others exercised influence through trade. But few systems were as complex as the model that emerged from British power. At the height of the British Empire, three fundamental elements sustained its influence. First, the financial system. Institutions such as the Bank of England helped build a global network of credit and trade. The second element was what is called soft power, cultural influence, the English language, educational systems, and cultural values that spread across the world. The third element was naval power. The British Navy ensured secure trade routes and allowed the empire to connect entire continents. Over time, the British territorial empire disappeared. Colonies became independent nations. But some analysts suggest that certain structures of power remained. They simply changed form. According to this interpretation, direct military control was replaced by global financial networks. Instead of openly governing territories, financial systems began to exert economic influence. An example frequently cited in this debate involves the global system of illicit trade, especially international drug trafficking. The production of certain drugs occurs mainly in specific regions. For example, Cocaine is often associated with parts of South America, but its consumption occurs across multiple continents. For this trade to function, something more than production and distribution is required. A financial system capable of processing large amounts of money is necessary. This money needs to be converted into apparently legitimate assets, investments, real estate, companies. This process is known as money laundering. It involves complex financial mechanisms that conceal the origin of funds. Offshore financial centers often appear in this context. These centers are regions with banking and legal systems that offer a high level of financial secrecy. Investors can transfer funds to these jurisdictions with little oversight. Some analysts observe that many of these centers emerged in territories historically linked to the former British Empire, the Caribbean, Hong Kong, Singapore, other strategic regions. This does not necessarily mean there is a coordinated plan, but it suggests that financial networks created during the imperial period continue to exert influence, even in a post-colonial world. Another interesting question arises in this context. If these financial centers are so profitable, why do all countries not adopt the same model? The answer may lie in something fundamental to any society: moral values, social cohesion. Activities such as money laundering, illegal gambling, or human exploitation can generate enormous profits, but they also erode social institutions. They can weaken public trust and generate deep cultural consequences. Societies that depend excessively on speculative financial flows may face another phenomenon: over-financialization. This term describes economies where financial activities begin to dominate real production. Instead of producing goods and services, much of the wealth circulates through investments and speculation. Over time, this model can generate extreme inequality. Small elites accumulate a large share of wealth, while large segments of the population face economic difficulties. This phenomenon has been observed in several developed economies: United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. In many of these countries, financial sectors have grown much faster than traditional productive sectors. Banks and financial markets have become central to the functioning of the economy. But highly financialized systems can produce unexpected side effects: political corruption, capture of public institutions, and loss of social trust. When wealth concentrates in small elites, the political system may begin to respond more to financial interests than to the interests of the population. This generates increasing social tensions. In addition, cultural values may also change. Societies highly oriented toward wealth may begin to value financial success above other aspects of life. Family, community, purpose, generosity. These values may lose space to the constant pursuit of profit. Some thinkers argue that this type of system contains an internal contradiction. It may generate enormous prosperity in the short term, but it can also produce moral and social decline in the long term. According to this view, empires often enter decline precisely because of their success. Excessive wealth can generate complacency, arrogance, and loss of social cohesion. If this interpretation is correct, it could help explain part of the current tensions in the Western world: rising inequality, political polarization, institutional crises. But this does not necessarily mean that the global system is about to collapse. History shows that societies often reinvent themselves. Reforms emerge. New ideas arise. Even so, some analysts believe that we are entering a period of profound transformation. a moment in which the global economic game may be approaching a tipping point. If this current system is not sustainable in the long term, new structures may emerge, new economic models, new forms of international cooperation, or new disputes for global power. What seems certain is that the coming decades may redefine many of the rules that have governed the world over the last centuries, and understanding the origins of this system is an important step toward understanding what may come next. The idea that the current global system may be approaching a limit raises an important question. What happens when an economic model becomes excessively successful? At first glance, economic success always seems positive. More wealth, more technology, more material comfort. But some analysts argue that extreme success can produce unexpected effects. When large amounts of wealth accumulate in certain countries or social groups, cultural changes begin to emerge. Societies may become more individualistic, more competitive, and in some cases, more unequal. This phenomenon can be observed in several developed economies. For decades, economic growth generated enormous prosperity, but it also produced concentration of wealth. Small financial elites began to control increasingly large amounts of capital, while many ordinary people face rising living costs, housing, education, healthcare. When these inequalities become too large, the political system may begin to lose legitimacy. Citizens begin to feel that their institutions no longer represent their interests. This process can generate social frustration, radical political movements, and intense ideological conflicts. Some analysts describe this moment as a period of systemic transition, a moment in which the existing model begins to show signs of wear, and new structures begin to emerge. But there is another aspect to this analysis, a more psychological aspect. Why do people continue to pursue wealth even when they know it does not guarantee happiness? Several studies show that factors such as family, purpose, and community have a much greater impact on human happiness. People with strong social relationships tend to live more satisfying lives. Even so, modern societies often value financial success above almost everything else. Billionaire entrepreneurs become idolized public figures, while poverty is often associated with personal failure. This dynamic creates a kind of social game, a system of incentives that pushes individuals to constantly compete for wealth and status. In this game, those who refuse to compete risk being marginalized. Companies that do not aggressively pursue profit may disappear. Countries that do not participate in the global economic system may lose influence. This creates a kind of collective dilemma. Even if many people recognize the system's problems, abandoning the game may mean losing strategic advantages. A metaphor often used to explain this phenomenon comes from the world of sportsy. Imagine a 100-meter race. All athletes know that using banned substances can harm their health in the long term. But if one athlete decides to use these substances and wins the race, the other competitors face a difficult choice. Either they follow the rules and lose, or they adopt the same risky strategy. In a short time, all participants may end up using harmful methods, not because they want to, but because the system pushes them in that direction. Some analysts believe something similar occurs in the global economy. Countries compete for growth. Companies compete for profits. Individuals compete for status. In the short term, this system can generate impressive economic energy, innovation, industrial expansion, technological advances. But in the long term, it can produce side effects: extreme inequality, social exhaustion, and periodic crises. According to this interpretation, the history of empires often follows a pattern: rise, prosperity, and eventually decline. During the phase of rise, societies possess great collective energy. They work hard. They innovate. Economic and cultural expansion occurs rapidly. But as wealth accumulates, new generations may grow up in more comfortable environments, and the motivation that drove the original rise begins to weaken. Some historians believe that this cycle has occurred with many empires throughout history: Rome, European empires, various ancient civilizations. If this analysis is correct, the modern world may be entering a similar phase. Not necessarily an immediate collapse, but a period of profound transformation. New centers of power may emerge, new economic models may arise, and the global system may be reorganized. Some call this process a global reset, a moment when old rules stop working, and new rules need to be created. The final outcome of this process remains uncertain. It may generate conflict, but it may also create space for innovation and reform. History shows that moments of crisis often precede periods of renewal. Societies learn from their mistakes. Institutions are reformed. New ideas emerge. Perhaps the true challenge of the 21st century is precisely this: to find ways to preserve economic prosperity without losing fundamental human values. Values such as community, responsibility, and collective purpose. Because without these elements, no economic system can remain healthy for long. If the world is truly approaching a new historical phase, understanding the forces that shaped the current system will be essential. Only then will it be possible to imagine different paths for the future. And perhaps that is the true meaning of the idea of a great reset. Not necessarily the end of the world, but the beginning of a new stage in the long history of human societies. The history of humanity is a journey, filled with discoveries, enigmas, and mysteries. Some have been understood, others still challenge our understanding. And it is precisely in these mysteries that we find the most fascinating questions. Subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the secrets of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.